And I used to work in a high-rise building downtown, and I had a parking stall that was just a block away from that building. And I used to have to drive every day from our house, which was about a 30-minute drive in the suburbs in the northwest of that city, downtown to the office tower where I worked. And I remember one time I got home, and I pulled into the driveway, and I got out of my car, and all of a sudden this thought occurred to me: how did I get here? It wasn't a matter that I was thinking about the life that we were living, because life was actually great. It was a question about our location, and my location in particular, because I had driven a half an hour, and I couldn't tell you what road I took. I couldn't tell you about the traffic that was on the roads, and it was the heat of rush hour traffic, but I couldn't remember anything. All that I remembered was being in the driveway, getting out of my car. I had done that whole drive on autopilot. Have you ever done that? Maybe going to and from work, maybe you've gotten to work and suddenly realized, oh, I have no idea how I got here, right? Or maybe at work, you were at work all day and you came home and your spouse said, how was your day? And you thought, I have no idea what I did today, right? Anybody ever do that, go through the whole day on autopilot? Or maybe there's a recipe that your family just loves, and you've cooked it over and over and over again. It's a Thanksgiving tradition, and you just do it on autopilot. And someone once said to you, can I get that recipe? And you thought, what is that recipe? Because you just do it. It just comes naturally. Sometimes we do that, don't we? Sometimes we just are on autopilot. We just do the same thing over and over again without even thinking about it. And the challenge is sometimes in our lives we can find ourselves on autopilot. That we can go through days and weeks and even years on autopilot, and suddenly we look up and we say, how did I get here? And we're not talking about the location, but we're talking about what's going on in your life. And we're in a series right now called Becoming. And in this series, we're asking a question every single week. The question is, who are you becoming? Because from the moment we are born to the moment we die, we are all becoming someone and something. And so the question we've been asking is, who is it that you are becoming? Because sometimes we can find ourselves on autopilot, and we can suddenly pay attention to what's going on around us, and we say, that wasn't who I wanted to become. That wasn't what I wanted to do in that situation. So who are you becoming today? We've looked over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about how challenges in our life are actually opportunities for us to change, that every challenge is an opportunity to change if we'll listen to some good advice. And our problem is that often we just try to struggle through it. Sometimes we just try to endure those challenges instead of turning to our Creator, the person who made us, the person who knows how life should actually be lived. And if we would just listen to Him, that He would actually help us change based on the challenges in our life. Change into the person that He created us to be. And we talked about our character. And we talked about how our actions and our reactions actually reveal something about what's going on inside of us. It reveals character issues. And last week we talked about the single greatest character trait that will shape our character if we will choose to love in the place of adversity, if we choose to love in the place of hardship, if we choose to love even those that are hard to love or that we don't even like, that it will change us inside. It'll deal with the character's issues inside of us. And today I want to talk to you about something else. I want to talk to you that goes alongside love, that goes alongside our character, and that is faith. And I want to talk to you about the role of faith in helping you become who you were created to be, because we are all becoming someone. And if we would embrace this thing called faith, that it will change us, it will transform us, and we will become the person that we long to become. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to the book of James. We're going to look at the role of faith and what faith is in helping us become who Jesus envisions for us. So we're going to look at James chapter 2, and it's on page 931 of the Brown Bibles. And we've been looking at this letter for the last number of weeks. It's written by a man named James, who's actually the little brother of Jesus. Can you imagine the insights that the little brother of Jesus would have on who Jesus is and what Jesus taught? And James writes this letter to people that he loves, people that he knows, friends, people who were part of his church before they moved away out of Jerusalem. And he writes to teach them about the Jesus way of living. And what I love about James is kind of like a commentary on his older brother. You know, it's like little brother having the last word almost sometimes. But James will take something that Jesus taught and he'll say, here's how it applies to your life. And so one of the things you could do while we're going through this series is actually read the book of James. It's only 5 chapters long. And then read something like the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew's account of the life of Jesus. And see how they cross over. See the parallels that are there. See how James takes something that Jesus says, which is already immensely practical, and James just takes it up another notch and says, here's what it looks like in everyday life. And the interesting thing about the people that James is writing to is they are a lot like us. And James is one of the most loved letters in the New Testament because it is so immensely practical, because it can help us 2,000 years ago, and it can help us today. And so let's look what James has to say. James chapter 2, starting at verse 14, he says this, "What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith save anyone?" James introduces us to this idea of faith, and he actually says there are different types of faith. Specifically, he says there's 2 types of faith. And all of us in this room, whether you've been to church for all of your life or whether this is your first time in church, all of us have some sort of faith that we operate on. Faith is a confidence in a system of beliefs. And we all have them. Whether you believe in Jesus, whether you believe in God, whether you believe in Allah, whether you believe in nothing, that there is no God, you have a confidence in a system of belief that drives your life. And so really, every single one of us, no matter what we believe, we all have faith in something. And James says that our faith can actually be categorized into 2 different types. He says there is saving faith, and then there is unsaving faith, or what he'll later describe as worthless faith. Faith that you might as well not invest into. Well, what is saving faith, and what is worthless faith? James continues on, and he says this. He says, verse 15, suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say goodbye and have a good day. Stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give that person any food or clothing. What good does that do? And James opens up this. He says there's 2 types of faith. And then he launches into an illustration, something that was probably happening with the people he was writing to. That as they were gathered together, much like we are gathering together, someone would come in and this person wouldn't be properly clothed for the elements that are going on outside. And they wouldn't be properly nourished. For our situation, think of it like a homeless person walking in the door. They haven't showered for quite some time, so the stench kind of greets you before they greet you. Think of them as skinny. They haven't eaten for some time, and their clothes are definitely not clothes that you would wear in a Saskatchewan winter. And that's the situation that he points to in this. And he says that somebody in the gathering goes up to them and says, "Be at peace." This is a blessing that is being spoken over the person. And this homeless person is identified as a brother or sister. He says, this is a Christ follower. This is a believer that is coming in to worship with you, and he's in need or she's in need. And someone goes up and says, "Be at peace," and he blesses them. He says, "Be well. Get some clothes. Go get something to eat. Take care. See you later." And does nothing to help. And these words of blessing are actually more in the form of a commandment. It's more like, go get something to eat and go get some clothes, and then you can come back here. And the person who's saying them is actually saying, go find somebody else to help you, because I'm not about to do it here. And James says, this is what unsaving faith looks like. Unsaving faith, the words do not back up what the faith says should happen. Faith is a confidence in a system of beliefs. Confidence in something you believe strongly in. For a Christ follower, this is a confidence in who God is and what God says. And James says your faith is worthless if you don't back it up with action. You see, good words don't do anyone any good, is what James is saying. Good words don't do anyone any good unless they are accompanied by action. And James says unsaving faith is ones that are empty, where the faith does not be expressed through our actions that we have. We don't care for those who are least among us. You see, when your faith is actionless, James says it's actually useless. That you can have all the faith in the world, but if the actions don't accompany it, it's worthless. It's like having good words and doing nothing about them. In the 1950s, the United States was embroiled in the space race with the Soviets. Some of you are old enough to remember that. I just read about it in history. I love history. And they were embroiled in the space race. Who was going to be the first to launch the first satellite? Who's going to be the first to launch the first animal into space? Who's going to be the first to launch the first human into space? And President Eisenhower was the president of the United States back then. And he wanted to beat the Soviets. He did. But he was concerned about the cost that it was going to have on the economy. And so even though he talked about wanting to win the space race, wanting to be first into space, he wasn't willing to put the money behind what was going on. And the Soviets launched the first satellite. The Soviets launched the first dog into space. The Soviets launched the first human into space. And then in the 1960s, another president came along, President Kennedy. And he said, maybe a speech that you've heard, he said, we choose to go to the moon in this decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard, and because it is the best way to manage our resources and our energies. And 7 years later, there was someone that walked on the moon for the first time, an American. Why? Because Kennedy put behind the resources that Eisenhower wouldn't. They were just empty words that he spoke. And yet Kennedy and Johnson, who followed, decided to put their money where their mouth was. And this changed everything when it came to the space race. And it is the same with our faith, is that oftentimes we can speak great words to each other. We can tell each other what we're thankful for. But when we leave this place or we go somewhere else and we see someone in need, we don't do anything to help them. And our faith, which is actionless, is actually useless. It doesn't save the person who's in need. And James says here that it doesn't even save you. That's the implication here. James is writing to Christ's followers living in the first century, people who have given up everything. They left Jerusalem because they were being persecuted. And he says, if someone walks in and they're homeless and they're in need and you do nothing to help them, then your faith is worthless. This faith that caused you to move from Jerusalem to somewhere else, if you're not backing it up in continual deeds, in actions to help other people in need, you might as well not have any faith. Think about that with me for a moment. When you think about your actions, what kind of faith do you have? Is it the saving faith or the unsaving faith, as James points out? Let's keep reading. James says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough unless it produces good deeds. It's dead and it's useless. And then he goes on and he says this, and this has been quite controversial for James. People have riled against this. They've derided James for what he says in verse 17 and 18. He says, now someone may argue, some people have faith, others have good deeds, but I say, how can you show me your faith if you don't have good deeds? I will show you my faith by my good deeds. And in James's day, there was people who were criticizing him for what he taught here. And some people today, some scholars today would say James is writing verse 18 in response to an argument that was being put at him. Some would even go so far as to say that he's writing verse 18 as an argument against a guy by the name of Paul. Paul was an apostle, a great missionary who traveled the ancient Near East telling people about Jesus. And Paul wrote these words in Ephesians 2. He said, God saved you by his grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift from God. Salvation is not a reward for the good things we have done, so none of us can boast about it. So James says, without deeds, your faith is dead. And Paul over here says something very different. He says, you are saved by grace through faith, and this not of yourself, so that no one can boast. That's how I learned it when I was a kid. That you can't earn the salvation that Jesus gives you. And some people have said that Paul and James are having this little argument going on in this chapter. But here's the problem with that statement. James writes around 46 AD. After Jerusalem, all the Christians vacated Jerusalem because of persecution. Paul, in 46 AD, was really a nobody. His teachings weren't very widespread. He hasn't written this letter to the Ephesians at that time. That's actually written 16 years after James writes what he writes. But still we struggle with this. Martin Luther, with a great church leader, he didn't like James at all. He said it was an epistle of straw because of this very argument. But here's the thing that we need to realize is that James and Paul are not disputing each other. They're not arguing with each other. They're looking at the same issue from different ends of it. James is writing in 46 AD. And the problem that was going on in James's day was that people were coming to know Jesus. They were coming to understand that Jesus died on the cross, gave his life up so that your sins could be forgiven and my sins could be forgiven. He rose from the dead. And because of the grace that Jesus has given, we are forgiven. There is nothing that we can earn that forgiveness. And some people in 46 AD, the Christians that James is writing to, are saying, Jesus forgave me, I can do whatever I want now because I can't earn anything else. But I have free grace and I can do anything. And James writes to them saying, hey, listen, you've got a wrong understanding about faith. And Paul, on the other end of the spectrum, at 62 AD, he writes to people who are saying, I have to earn my salvation. I have to do good works. And James says, no, it's a gift from God, so no one can boast. But actually, they both believe the same things. You see, Paul writes this in Galatians 5, verse 6. He says, for when we place our faith in Christ Jesus, there is no benefit in all of the external stuff. What is important is faith expressing itself in love. What is important is faith expressing itself in love. And James says, faith without works is dead. They have the same opinion of it. Is that, yes, we are saved by grace through faith. And that faith should begin to change us. And change the way that we act so that our faith is expressed in love, as Paul says, or our faith is expressed in deeds, as James says. And deeds and love, you can think of these things as interchangeably, because both of them are calls to action. And the church has always swung between these two ways, an intellectual faith and a faith of trying to earn forgiveness. And James and Paul are trying to bring everybody back to what faith really is. So tell me, where is your faith on this spectrum? The church swung from 46 to being completely intellectual. I can do whatever I want. I don't have to do anything good. Faith doesn't change my acts. To 62, where it's all about grace. Right? You don't have to earn your salvation. And again, we see that in the Reformation. This is what the Reformation is all about. The church leaders in 1500. They were saying you have to earn your salvation, and Martin Luther comes along and he says, no, it's by grace through faith, and that's it. And we've seen this even in my lifetime as the church has said, we have to learn as much, we have to be educated, and then the missional church has come along and said, no, we have to do things, we have to serve people, we have to help people, and there's this spectrum that keeps swinging back and forth, and where do you fit on that spectrum? James says this, he keeps going and he says, you say you have faith, for you believe that there is only one God. Good for you. Even the demons believe this, and they tremble in terror. How foolish. Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? James says, you know what? The demons, the bad guys in the world, they believe there's one God, and it does nothing for them. They have unsaving faith. That's what he's saying there. Is that the demons believe there's one God. James reuses this phrase, one God, which is the Jewish Shema, the basic belief of every Jew. They would say this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Okay? That was the start of Deuteronomy 6. And this became something, this is actually a blessing that they write on their door frames. Hear, O Israel, the Lord their God is one. And James says, that's great that you believe that. That's true. But here's the thing. Demons believe that, and it does them no good. And what James is pushing back against is an intellectual faith. It's to saying, I know everything there is to know about God, but my actions don't demonstrate that. And sometimes we can be like that, right? And James says, when your faith is purely intellectual, it's pointless. It's pointless. If all you have is head knowledge and there is nothing you do to help the people around you, then you're better off not believing because it is unsaving faith. But James wants us to live out our faith. And he goes on and he gives us two examples of people that are extremely different. One is Abraham, who for the Jew is the father of their faith. And the other is Rahab, a prostitute. You cannot get two different ends of a spectrum. And James says this, don't you remember that our ancestor Abraham was shown to be right with God by his actions when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? This story is from Genesis 22. And in your groups this week, I want you to dig deeper into these two stories, into these two examples. Genesis 22 talks about Abraham taking his one and only son Isaac, the son that he has waited his entire life to have. And God says, I want you to take your son that you love so much, and I want you to take him up onto a mountain, and I want you to sacrifice him to me. And Abraham does it. He takes his son up to the mountain. He builds an altar. He binds his son and lays his son on that altar, and he's got the knife poised above Isaac's body, and God says, stop. And he provides him another sacrifice. It had all been a test to see if Abraham's faith was as strong as he said it was. And James tells this story because he's illustrating a point. He says, you see, his faith and his actions worked together. His actions made his faith complete. And so it happened, just as the scripture says, Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. This quote that he has in the passage, that Abraham's faith was credited as righteousness, this is a quote from Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. In Genesis chapter 15, God appears to Abraham, and he says, Abraham, I'm going to make you a promise, a covenant, a promise that you will have land, which Abraham didn't have. He was a nomadic person. That you will have children, which Abraham didn't have, and he and his wife Sarah were very old. And you are going to be a blessing to the nations. Genesis 15, verse 6. It says that Abraham believed, and that amount of faith that he had was enough that it was credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 22, which James writes about, happens 30 years later. And James says it's that act, that incredible act. You know what? The Abraham of Genesis 15 would never have sacrificed his son. Because if you read what happens between 15 and 22 in the book of Genesis, what you see is a man who says, I believe you, God, that you will fulfill these promises. But every time we see Abraham, he's doing something to try and advance those promises on his own. That's not a man who trusts God to fulfill his promises. But there was enough faith in Abraham in Genesis 15 that God credits him with righteousness. And then for the next 30 years, Abraham begins doing just little things that change his faith, that build his faith, until 30 years later, he's up on a mountain with his son, willing to sacrifice him, because he believes, the book of Hebrews 11 tells us this, that he believed that God was faithful to his promises, that even if he killed Isaac, that God would raise his son back up from the dead, or find some other way to fulfill the promises that he made in Genesis 15, 30 years earlier. Abraham is a changed man. Why? Because of the faith that he expressed. And every day he made a choice to trust God, to believe that God is faithful, to have confidence in who God is and what he says and the way that he wants him to live. And his faith builds and builds to the point where he is a completely different man than he was in Genesis 15. James keeps writing, and he talks about Rahab. And he says this, Rahab the prostitute is another example. She was shown to be right with God by her actions when she hid those messengers and sent them safely away by a different road. So Rahab's story is in the book of Joshua, and you can read about this in your groups as well. But Rahab, here's her story briefly. She is a prostitute in the city of Jericho. And she hears the story about what God has been doing in the life of the Israelites. This massive amount of people that are gathering on the other side of the Jordan River, right across from where Jericho is. I mean, they would have been able to see the encampment of these people camped on the other side of the Jordan River. This is how close they were. Would have been a mile or two away, but there was so many people that made up the Israelite camp that they would have seen it. And she hears the story from 40 years ago, how God parted the Red Sea, how God destroyed Pharaoh and his army, about how in the time since then God has continued to work in the life of the Israelites. This is by her own testimony. She says this, I've heard of the good things that you have done, and I realize that yours is the true God. And Rahab, who doesn't really know this God, only has heard his reputation, has enough faith to hide some spies who come to scope out Jericho in preparation for the invasion. And when some army guys come by and say, hey, have you seen these spies? She hides them. Again, another act of faith. And then she sneaks them out of the city. And then she hangs a red cord in the window Because that's what they said. They said, if you will hang this cord, we will make sure that your family is safe. And she chooses to have an act of faith to hang this cord in the window. And she is saved. Her and her family are saved. And they go and they live amongst the Israelites from that point on. And Rahab has just a little bit of faith to take in some spies, a little bit of faith to hide them from the army that comes by, a little bit of faith to trust that they will save her when the destruction comes. And this changes her life, so much so that Rahab is one of 3 women that are mentioned in the genealogies of Jesus in the first chapter of Matthew. That this prostitute, if you had a prostitute in your family, would you brag about this? If your grandma, your great-grandma, you may or probably not is going to be my guess, right? Not in today's society. Certainly not back then. And yet here, she is held up. Why? Because she put her faith in Jesus, and this transforms her life in a significant way. So she's no longer remembered as that person, but she's remembered as an ancestor of our Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. This is the power of faith in who you are becoming, that it will transform who you are becoming. When your faith is action-packed, your life is transformed. When you begin to act based on what you believe, when you begin to act based on what you know about God, all of the intellect, for sure, pour all your intellect into discovering who God is, into learning about Him, but don't stop with the intellect. Begin to help those around you who are the least. There is a theme in James that we just keep coming back to week after week after week. James keeps talking about the poor. First, James said that the poor are honored. He says that the poor, that true religion which God desires is caring for the widows and the orphans, for the poor, the marginalized in society. And now he comes back around here, and he uses an illustration about the poor in this passage, not because it's just convenient, it's a creative thing that he's doing. No, because he's addressing a real problem in the church in the first century. That the church had forgotten to care for the least. And if you read the book of Acts, which is the history of the first church, you see that this is what happens. Is that things are going great in the first 6 chapters of Acts. And then all of a sudden, they stop caring for the widows and the orphans. And problems break out in the church. And they have to correct it. If you read the letters of Paul, you read about how the church wanted to care, and Paul had to keep reminding people, care for the poor, care for the poor. Why? Because we keep forgetting about it. And the reason why it's so important to care for the poor in our society is because your faith is seen the most in how you care for the least. Your faith is seen the most in how you care for the least. And so James says, be involved. Care for those who can't help you back, who there's no benefit to you from helping. You know, sometimes we invite people over for dinner, right? And it's like, well, it's a tit for tat kind of thing, right? You come to my place and we go to your place, and this is kind of a nice thing that we do, right? James says, no, invite somebody over who can never pay you back, who can never do the same thing for you that you are doing for them. Because that's when your faith is put into action. And when your faith is in action, your life will be transformed like Abraham's was, like Rahab's was. Because faith and action, they go together. And if you want to become who Jesus envisions, you got to have faith in who Jesus is, but you got to make sure that that action is being lived out every single day, that your faith shapes your action. There's one more verse in our passage. James says this, just as the body is dead without breath, so also faith is dead without good works. James talks about the body and how it's dead without breath. That, you know, the body without breath, that's what faith is without action. It's just dead. And breath without a body is just a bunch of air. And that's what actions is. And without them, there's lots of good people doing good actions in the world but don't have any faith. And yet our world continues to be messed up, right? How long have we had homelessness in the world? And there's been lots of good words spoken. Yet I wonder if it's because the church hasn't dug into this the way that we should. I wonder if this is the reason why our world is as it is today. It's because we haven't been people of faith and action. Faith and action are meant to be intertwined. It's kind of like a double helix. Do you know what a double helix is? You take two strands and kind of twist them together. And faith and action are to be twisted together like a double helix. And if you look at the life of Jesus, what you see in Jesus is that he cared deeply for everyone that was around him. That his faith, he had faith in God the Father, that if he gave his life, if he sacrificed his life, that God would forgive us, that we would be reconciled with the Father. And Jesus, every day of his life is filled with actions based on that faith, as he cares for the sick, as he cares for the dying, as he brings people back to life. And faith and action are intertwined in the life of Jesus. And you know, the double helix is often used for DNA. That's how it represents DNA to us. And when you think about it, you have faith and you have action, and what holds them together is what we talked about last week, is love. That when we have faith, we realize the love of Christ for us, a love of Christ that compels us to act. And this is the Jesus DNA. This is the DNA that is to be in every Christ follower, a life of faith that compels love, that compels us to action. And this is to be who we are, known for our love, known for our actions, because we have a faith that transforms our life. Where do you fit with faith and action? How should we respond to what James has talked about today? Let me give you 3 ways: something to know, something to believe, and something to do. Something to know. Know that your faith without action is useless. That you can have all the good deeds in the world, but if you don't have faith, it's pointless. And if you have faith, but you aren't caring for the least among you, if you aren't letting that faith shape your actions, then it is completely useless. Our faith is all built around sacrifice. Do you know that? That God sacrificed his Son for us. And that sacrifice of faith should shape us. It should be part of the DNA that we are willing to sacrifice as well. So know that if you are not sacrificing yourself for someone else, that your faith is useless. No, believe. Believe that faith, when combined with action, will transform your life. James writes to the believers in order to help them to become mature. He says this in the first chapter. He says that I'm writing so that you would be mature and able to stand through everything. And James sees faith and action as incredibly important to helping you mature. Do you know what maturity looks like in the life of a Christ follower? When you become a Christ follower, it's all about you. As you grow as a Christ follower, it becomes about we, the community that you belong to. When you are mature as a Christ follower, you go from me to we to you. Okay? When I first came to Christ, it was about me. Then I became part of a community. It was about us, about we. But as I mature, it becomes less and less about me. And even in we, there's something in me in the middle of we. But when I am mature, it becomes about you. And how can I help you? And how can I sacrifice for you? And this is what we see in Jesus, who lived a you-centered life and sacrificed it all. So believe that when faith and action are combined together, that your life can be transformed. That little acts of faith taken over time will grow, just as they did in Abraham, just as they did in Rahab. And in years to come, you will look back and say, look at how much I have grown because of that one little act of faith, just like Abraham did. And do, is to start to act on and act out your faith. Start to act on and out your faith. Let your actions be shaped by the things you believe, by the Jesus that you follow. Let his DNA begin to take over and transform your life so that your actions are fundamentally different. So that the people you walk by in downtown Regina who need help, that suddenly you start to see them differently. And you start to take acts of faith. Here's the great things about faith, okay? Is that if you will just take a little step of faith, if you will begin to act on and act out your faith, that actually you find out that God is faithful. That's the great thing about it. You say, I'm going to try this. I'm going to take this action. I'm going to help this person, even at sacrifice to myself. And you find out that actually God is faithful to you, that he proves himself right in your life. And you say, wow, wow, I didn't realize that actually helping somebody would actually turn out this way, that I would actually be blessed by helping somebody else. And then you say, I want to do that again, right? It's like a kid's going to an amusement park. When my son was like 5 years old, we took him to Disneyland. And there's this ride, Grizzly Mountain, I think it's called. It's a wet water wild ride. And we would go through it, and we would get off and come out the exit. Can we go again, Dad? I'm like, okay, let's go. So we went on that 12 times in a row. We were absolutely soaked to the bone. And if you will act on and act out your faith, that's what will happen to you. You will get off this ride, and you will say, God, can I do that again? And you'll go back on it, and you'll go again and again and again until you are soaked to the bone and utterly changed as his Spirit begins to take over and transform your life. This is the amazing thing about faith in action, is that it changes you and it helps you become what Jesus envisions. So who are you becoming today? Maybe it's time to take life off autopilot and take a look at your faith and see where you are on that spectrum that I talked about. Maybe it's time to consider that there might be a better way of doing things. Maybe it's time to take just a little bit of faith, to take a step of faith, to act on it, and let God prove that he is who he said he is, that he loves you, and that you are forgiven if you put your faith in Jesus Christ. I want to invite Rick Orban up. We're going to, as part of this series, we want it really to be a dialogue, a discussion about what we're talking about. And so each week at the end of the sermon, we're having a Q&A. And so Rick, on the screen, there's been a number that you can text in questions to. If you didn't realize that until right now, that's cool. Just come and text right now, and Rick will get that, and he's going to ask me the questions. And then we will wrap up our time together. So, I don't know if does your cord reach up there?
They've given me a special mic here. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Okay.
Okay, I have a couple.
Okay.
All right.
I feel like we could have like rope fights.
Yeah. Skip.
We'll skip. Skipping rope.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. There are a couple people who I'm trying to get to church who do more works than me. They're very dedicated to helping the poor, but really have no use for God. How would you suggest I steer them to saving faith? Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, what I hear you saying is there's this group of people that, they're doing all these great things, but there's no faith, and you would like to introduce them to Jesus, right? Which is a great thing to do. What I would suggest is serve alongside them. Really, that's what it's going to take. Serve alongside them, and as you are serving, and this is what I found in my own life, is that as I enter into someone else's life, as I walk with them, as I talk with them, that actually doors begin to open, and I begin to share my faith. It is not, okay, I'm a pastor, but I'm going to say this, it is not all about coming into this building, okay? But this gathering of people is incredibly important in your life at the same time. So it's all not about getting your friends here. It is about you walking with them, serving alongside them. And when it comes to this point where, you know what, when you're serving alongside somebody and it gets frustrating, has that ever happened to you? You get frustrated when you're serving sometimes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, he serves with me. So that's just Tuesday morning, we call that. But sometimes it gets frustrating, and in the midst of that frustrating, and a conversation develops, and it's like, oh, it's so frustrating. I don't know why I do this sometimes, because at some point, someone's going to get frustrated, and they're probably going to say something like that. Guess what? There's an open door there for you to begin to say, you know what, sometimes I don't know why I do this either. But then I start to think about the sacrifice that was made for me and how Jesus served me in a significant way. Do you see how I entered into their life and looked for open doors so that I could talk about Jesus with them? And then maybe, just maybe, at some point, after you've done that for some time, and it'll take years. There's some people in my life that I've been walking with for years. And getting them through this door, this isn't something they want to do. Getting through that door isn't something we want to do. But if you'll walk alongside with them and show them what saving faith looks like, then you may get the chance to tell them about saving faith and maybe even introduce them to a whole bunch of people like the people in this room who have saving faith.
Okay, all right. What is the greatest need for action in the church from a corporate perspective, but what is the greatest need for action in the church, in our church family?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So this, thanks. I don't know who asked that question, but high five. I love it. You know, we are, I will say two things. I'll say first, we are figuring things out here, okay? And what is it that our church is uniquely equipped for? Because every church has a personality. If you've been to multiple churches in your life, you know this. Every church has a personality. Every church has a gifting. And we're in the process of figuring out what it is. One of the things that we are leaning into is poverty and domestic abuse. And so we have a couple of agencies that we are talking with about how can we partner with them when it comes to domestic abuse. We have our Compassion Connection team, which is talking and working with people in poverty. And so there's two ways that you can get involved there. These are organizations outside the church. Within our church, there's another opportunity. Okay, so if you're interested in Compassion Connection or is this domestic abuse thing that I've talked about, write on a green card. Love to talk with you offline about that, just because we can't have a conversation like this, even though we're trying. The other thing that we're doing is that on Wednesday nights, there is a course that started this past week on learning to care. And the reason why we're offering this course is because we realize that within this room there are a lot of people who look good on the outside and are hurting on the inside. All right? Anyone ever been like that? I have been like that. There have been times when I have walked into church and I'm got a smile on my face, but really I'm broken on the inside. And what we want to create is a people care team who will care for people in our church who are in need, who aren't going to come up to the front, who aren't going to raise their hands, but you know, we might hear through the grapevine that there's a need, that there's someone to do. And so we're offering this course to begin to train our church on how to care for each other. And if you'd like to be involved in that and caring for each other, come on Wednesday night, because out of that, my hope is that we'll birth this people care team that will begin to care for each other in ways that we can't even imagine what it would be.
We've got about 3 more. Should I just pick one?
One more, yeah,
Okay.
you pick.
This is one I think is a bit different. There is a Bible verse that speaks about working out our salvation with trembling and fear. I sometimes struggle to reconcile that verse with the idea of grace and faith. Any insights?
Yep. So that verse says, continue to work out your fear with your salvation with fear and trembling. It's one of my favorite verses, actually, because what it actually goes to what we've just spoke about, how there is, because the verse right before that is Philippians 2, and I'm not going to get to it quick enough. I need one of those Bibles with the finger holes in them. What he says here, he says, dear friends, you always followed my instructions when I was with you, and now that I am away, this is Paul writing, it is even more important. Work hard to show the results of your salvation, obeying God with deep reverence and fear. So that's the New Living Translation that we talk about. So working out your salvation with fear and trembling means we accept through faith that we are forgiven, okay? But that's not the end of the story. That our faith should cause us to do things. The fear part of that, because we often hear about fear, and our natural reaction in our society, in our culture today, is fear is like, oh, Rick, don't do that to me, right? Isn't that what fear is all about? But that's not what fear is when we look at the Old Testament and the New Testament. That fear is this. It's like, wow, Rick, you are incredible, okay? And at the same time, you are incredibly powerful, so I'm not sure I want to get near you. All right? But actually, there's something about you, Rick, that draws me to you. And this is what fear of God looks like. It is about saying there is a God who is powerful enough to create our universe. There is a God who is transcendent above everything that we could ever imagine. There is a God who is holier, who does things right all the time, whereas we mess up all the time. Okay, maybe I just mess up all the time. You guys are a little bit better than me. There is a God who is like that. And we should cower back in fear because of all the mistakes we make. Because he is so powerful and we are not. We are awestruck in fear. But at the same time, there is a God whose defining characteristic, as we talked about a few weeks ago, is love. A God who says, I want to be your shepherd. I want to care for you. I want to guide you in life. I want to love you. I want to forgive you. I want to bring you close. And so it's this thing of saying, I'm scared, but at the same time, I'm amazingly drawn to you, and I want to be close to you. I love the way the New Living Translation puts it, with deep fear, it says, with deep reverence and fear. And it is recognizing who God is and who I am, recognizing that I am not God and he is, and then continuing to act on steps of faith. And you're working out your faith because each time you take a step of faith, okay, with fear and trembling, you're saying, okay, I'm trusting you, God, that you will actually prove faithful to me. And when God does, it's like, okay, I'm going to take another faith step. And you're continuing to work out your faith with fear and trembling. Does that make sense?